Hello and welcome to another edition of Community Spotlight. I'm your host, Derek Hudson, and joining me today is Dr. George Haggerty. Thank you for being here, Doctor.
Thank you very much.
Now, Doctor, you are an expert in the area of how people learn differently.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, that's
Now,
correct.
a terminology that we often hear is learning disability. But my understanding is maybe a better way of saying that is people just learn differently.
Yes, an individual with a learning disability, as it's defined under federal law and state law, is an individual who has difficulty learning or understanding because of an issue that is in their brain and is not from some kind of outside influence. These individuals may have difficulty with reading, with writing, with mathematics.
Okay, so when we use the term learning disability, it sounds like in many, or maybe even all cases, it may be a misnomer.
Yes, because the reality is when you've met one person with a learning disability, you've met one person with a learning disability. The reality is they have the broad spectrum of interests and passions and strengths and challenges as any other individual.
Mm-hmm. So people learn differently. What are some of the ways that the people learn?
Well, people can be a visual learner, a dominant visual learner, dominant auditory learner, or a dominant kinesthetic learner, experiential learner. And the real secret is to find out what that dominant influence is in the way that you learn. I have a visual impairment, and so I've had to go from being primarily a visual learner, which is what I was as a young child, to an auditory learner. And that transition for me was a bit of a difficult transition because I didn't have any preparation for it. I think the reality is that now that we're becoming more and more sophisticated with the ability to assess the strengths, learning strengths, that we're able to determine what that mode is that you learn best with.
So, if I might ask, how old were you when you needed to make that transition from being a visual learner to more auditory?
I was 19 years old when I had an eye disease which attacked both retinas and has resulted in a pretty significant visual impairment. But very much like students with learning disabilities, ADHD, some students on the spectrum, the autistic spectrum, it's very much for me and for anybody that I meet pretty much a hidden disability.
So you can't see it. It's not like a missing limb or being I guess, confined to a wheelchair or something like that.
Right, and the interesting thing is I've spent a lot of time overseas before I came to the college that I'm at right now, 5 years overseas, and then after becoming president, we've had a number of opportunities to go and speak overseas. And the reality is that the issue of learning disabilities and ADHD, all of those areas in which we say students learn differently, it's not confined to the United States. It's a major issue across all borders.
So, two questions. The first question is, how soon do we start learning the way that we do? How soon, how early in our lives do we begin processing information the way that we do?
Well, early childhood educators will say it happens sometimes, sometime between 18 months and 2 years. Mm-hmm. The way that learning disabilities are picked up and other hidden disabilities are picked up is that a child does not seem to be developing at the pace that they might be expected to develop at a certain age. And if it's not picked up at that point before a child goes to school, It usually is picked up because of the sophistication of our system, our educational system in this country. It's usually picked up sometime during the elementary years.
So if a student is called, and I'll use the term slow learner, I think that was a term that was used quite a bit when during my school days, that could mean that they just learn differently.
It is, and now slow learner would be a pejorative term that would be used. And what we have come to understand, certainly in the last 30 or 40 years, is that the brain has certain spheres. For instance, a student with learning disabilities is pretty much a right brainer in a left brain world. Their creative sphere is really working overtime. And there's a little known fact that is in the research that individuals, entrepreneurs with learning disabilities have a 3 times greater likelihood of succeeding than the average population of entrepreneurs. Why is that, you might ask?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think the answer is that these individuals have their creative sphere working overtime. And the second piece of that is they have come up against enormous challenges in trying to come into a school system or a workplace full of left-brainers when they're a right-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have met these challenges and overcome these challenges.
So you mentioned entrepreneurs. For me, that brings to mind inventors. I think of folks like Thomas Edison, George Washington Carver, and others. So are you telling me that there is a chance, a probability, or even a known fact that, that men like these and women too, who have been inventors and entrepreneurs, would be in that category? Absolutely.
There are individuals now in all professions, but you take Richard Branson, who everybody knows, Virgin Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very outspoken advocate for learning disabilities because he has a significant learning disability.
Really?
And here he is running a corporation, creating the airline industry in a very different way, the international airline industry. But that's the power of a right-brainer in a left-brain world.
That's interesting. Any other celebrities or famous names that our viewers may have heard that would?
Certainly, Henry Winkler is the actor is very outspoken on his learning disability and on improving the societal acceptance of individuals with learning disabilities. Seinfeld came out about 2 years ago and said that Jerry Seinfeld,
the comedian.
He believes that he is on the autistic spectrum.
Really?
So what used to be a taboo is no longer, and I think that's a very healthy thing. One of the things that I have noticed internationally is that those taboos still exist, and so I think we've made enormous progress since the passage of the first federal laws in 1975 to provide special education to all students with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And that is both in instruction and in the research that leads us to the understanding of the etiology of these conditions, and that the term learn differently, I think, is increasingly being used because we realized that to some degree these are not disabilities if in fact you have the appropriate toolkit to move forward. And that includes some disciplined workarounds. I have all sorts of workarounds for my eye issue. And students with learning disabilities, individuals with learning disabilities, have an enormous number of workarounds to get around the inability to read, the inability to understand. Students with ADHD who many times need focus. They have all sorts of ways of putting a toolkit together that allows them to work both in the employment setting and in a social setting.
So you mentioned the word focus. When I hear the term ADHD, attention deficit disorder, what comes to mind for me anyway, that, oh, whoever's diagnosed with that diagnosis has an inability to focus. But what you just said is that there are workarounds. So it sounds like we actually focus differently. We all focus differently. Would that be true?
So yes, and there's another part of the term that's presently used, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some hyperactivity, some do not have the hyperactivity component. But if students are placed in the right educational environment and there can be support in the home, these individuals can be enormously successful in growing into adulthood. And that is a huge area that is unexplored right now, that's just being explored, which is emerging adulthood for these individuals for the full range of disabilities.
Mm-hmm. So what are some ways that an individual, some specific ways, I mean just a few examples on someone who may have a diagnosis like ADHD or
Well,
how can they cope?
For learning disabilities, they are probably working hard on their visual abilities,
Mm-hmm.
but their auditory abilities are pretty strong. And so these students can work on their classroom work by also listening. Books on tape are very, very important
Mm-hmm.
to many of our students. In the area of writing, having somebody who can help edit your work and work closely with you and know some of the areas where you do have challenges, that is a very important piece. Not to do the work for the student or the individual, not to do the work for them, but to help them learn how to write effectively.
So the way people are processing information, is it, I guess that'd be a neurological thing?
Yes. A lot of this has to do not only with the ability or inability to process information, but the tempo of the processing.
The pace?
The pace. Some individuals have a pace that's a bit slower. They need to be more careful. And in accommodating individuals, we really need to think about their tempo, their pace of learning and working.
As we were just speaking, chatting before we began to actually broadcast, you and I shared a story. You're a musician, and you have an uncle that played many instruments. I'm a musician, and I remember in high school that we memorized much of the music, and particularly during the marching season. And for me, it was repetition. You learn one section of music at a time. But I learned that the more I did that, the faster I could do it. So let's talk about that part of learning. How much is repetition needed?
Well, there's a wonderful book out called The Power of Habits, and it really talks about the synapses that become a habit in the brain. And the more that we can create, and really what we are as human beings is a collection of habits, and the more that we can work on a habit and creating a habit that is going to be effective for an individual to learn, to express themselves and all the rest, the better it is. So I'm sure in memorizing your music, you had to go over and over and over it.
That's right.
In the same way, a student with learning disabilities or ADHD is probably going to take a little longer to really master some of the content, particularly at the college level where I am right now. It takes them somewhat longer, and it also requires individuals who can support them and keep them on task.
I see. So we mentioned celebrities. Henry Winkler, for our viewers who may not remember, played the part of Fonzie in the Happy Days series, and he's been in a few movies too. You mentioned Richard Branson, entrepreneur. Anybody else come to mind?
Well, the big one is Einstein. Einstein.
E equal MC square
E
Einstein?
equal MC squared Einstein. He is thought to have had a learning disability. And you know, now everybody pretends that they understand exactly what his IQ level was. They say it was 150. I don't know how they know that. But the reality is that we need to understand is an individual who has a learning disability or ADHD likely has average to high average intelligence. They have an island of challenge, and they need to work around that island of challenge. Their brain works differently in certain areas, and once they can master how to learn, how to express, how to work, they can be just as effective. There's a lot of research out there that says they make that individuals with these issues are very effective in the employment setting. So it's really the reality that many of the students that we serve have very high IQs. The reality is that there's a portion of their brain that has them learning differently, and so that we work with that.
We know from history that Albert Einstein was a violinist. I understand he spent a lot of time playing. I think he may have been a painter too.
He did some painting.
How does that creative, that expressive piece tie in with that ability to learn and to succeed?
Part of the focus, what we've seen certainly in high schools and in colleges with students who learn differently, is they are very artistically oriented, and that a student with ADHD who has a passion for art can really remain focused on that passion. And it's almost as if the issues that they may have had in other areas has disappeared once they get into their art. So as I said, these are, we call them right-brainers, and that may be too simple an explanation, but the creative sphere is working very, very well. And so music, theater, they tend to do exceptionally well if that in fact is their passion, because let's remember how we started this conversation. If you've met one student with one of these learning issues, you've met one student with the learning issue.
So sounds like, from what you just shared, even though there can be multiple people, different ages, from adolescence on up to well into adulthood, that may have the same, quote, diagnosis. However, it sounds like, from what you just shared, that diagnosis makes, we'll say, express itself, or it'll look different. Is that right?
Yeah, I've always believed that individuals who are identified under the federal definitions as having a disability, they have only one thing in common, and that is their inability to learn effectively in the regular environment without some supplementary instruction, aid, or service. That's the one common feature that they have. And so that's why early identification is really important. It's why a effective evaluation and diagnosis, not misdiagnosing what the student has, is very important, and why special ed instruction in an integrated environment is really the way to go for all of these students. But they do need that, that support, that additional support to really be highly effective, productive students, and hopefully highly effective and productive citizens as adults.
Well, we remember, or I remember, I'm sure we all remember, back in, for me, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, in the health class, it was important. You've got to eat your 4 basic food groups. You got to have nutrition. What part does nutrition play in this?
Well, for most of our students, they're just like any other student. They like some of the junk food. They prefer the pizza and the cheeseburgers, just as any other student would. But the reality is that there are some underlying issues with some of these disabilities, and a high preponderance of depression and of anxiety. And many times, one of the ways that they soothe themselves is by overeating. And so they need to be enormously careful as to what they are putting into their mouths at any time. And hopefully, schools are now, and certainly in the last 8 years, it's been become a priority, healthy food. And that's, I think schools have the obligation to make sure that these students, in particular, are making healthy choices, because if they do have some of these concomitant issues, these paralleling issues of depression or anxiety, they can soothe themselves through eating. So let's make sure it's good food as opposed to some of the things that they would probably prefer to eat.
Yeah, fast food is easy. Now, what about this? And for you viewers, you probably will remember this, laws of motion. Going back to science, I like to do that now and then. A body in motion tends to stay in motion. How important is exercise?
That's a great question. There's research available, and I think it's quite deep, that physical exercise helps enormously, particularly with students who have ADHD, because it helps them burn off what may be their edge with the hyperactivity. It certainly, I happen to believe as an educator that healthy activities outside the classroom make for healthy learning inside the classroom. They're better prepared to learn. And so I think physical exercise is enormously important for any student. But for those students that we're talking about here who learn differently, they really do need to put in some time to give their brain a rest and to do some things that are really going to help their overall health.
And speaking of bodies in motion, staying in motion, are there any professional athletes that come to mind that had any diagnosis you're aware of?
Michael Phelps.
Oh, the swimmer.
The swimmer.
Most Olympic medals of all time, right?
Supposedly, and he's stated it, he was both, he felt he was both learning disabled and ADHD. And so certainly swimming helped him overcome some challenges that I'm sure that he confronted, because the reality is that swimming made him an enormously successful and productive individual with some learning differences.
Much focus. much focus.
And in that case also, we need to recognize the role of the parent. His mother recognized that there were issues with him. And she was a real support system for him, certainly in his high school years, to really keep him focused on not only his swimming, but also the schoolwork that attended that.
So what would be your message to anyone who wants to learn more about how they learn, or for parents, how their children learn?
There are certainly tests out there that through a psychoeducational evaluation that many students have, particularly if they're going into special ed. But there are some less formal ways that I might recommend. We all, I think, innately know what our strength is as far as whether a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learner, experiential learner. So we have a sense of that. But talk to the educators, talk to the classroom teacher who's working with your son or your daughter, and see what they perceive as they go through the instructional process as to what the strength is in their mode of taking in information. And I would say 95% of the time they're going to have a good read on what the dominant mode is. Additionally, parents have a sense they need to trust their intuition on a couple of things. Number one, if their son or daughter is not progressing as well as their peers in certain areas, they're the first ones to know, and they're the first ones to identify it. They need to trust their instincts on that. And then to make it known, certainly, to the school system.
Well, thank you. This is very good information, very educational. I appreciate you being here, Doctor.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. So that's a wrap up for today's Community Spotlight. We've been talking about a segment of the population. Sometimes we'll hear the term individuals diagnosed with learning disabilities. We know now from Dr. Haggerty that maybe a better term is people that learn differently, which would be all of us. We learn differently. So we want to make sure that you know everything that's happening in your Lakefront City. Be sure and visit us at leesburgflorida.gov. And until next time, go out and enjoy the Lakefront City of Leesburg.